We stand at 41 years old. Naomi Weller had exactly $11 sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt, and nowhere in the whole of Wyoming Territory that she could call home. It was her husband's brother, Elias Weller, who cast her out, telling the deacons and the dry goods clerks and anyone who would listen that the widow had dipped her hand into the poor box the winter her husband died, though not a soul had ever seen her do it. With the little she had left after the coach fare, she walked into the forgotten town of Sparrow Creek and paid $5, her very last $5, for a collapsing, sun-bleached barn that had belonged to a dead outlaw nobody would speak of by name. Folks called it foolish. Folks called it worse. But sealed inside those rotting boards was something that had waited more than 20 years to be found, something that would not only save Naomi Weller, but return to an entire valley what had been stolen from it in the dark. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Weller. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, tell us where you're writing from in the comments below. Naomi Calloway had been raised on the kind of Ohio farmland that rewarded patience before it rewarded anything else. In a clapboard house with a mother who kept every torn dress and cracked plate rather than throw it away, insisting that nothing was ever truly ruined, only misunderstood. Her father had been a wheelwright, and from him she had learned to see the bones beneath a broken thing, where the crack ran, where the strength still lived. How a wheel that looked finished could be coaxed back into turning if a person had the patience to listen to the wood instead of fighting it. It was not a fashionable skill for a girl to have, and her mother worried aloud more than once that no young man would want a wife who came home from Sunday supper with sawdust in her hair. But her father only laughed and said that a woman who could see value where other people saw ruin would never go hungry, not truly, not in her spirit, whatever else might happen to her purse. Naomi carried that lesson the way other girls carried scripture verses, turning it over in quiet moments, testing it against the world. She married Thomas Weller in 1874, when she was 24 and he was a broad-shouldered young man freshly arrived from the eastern coalfields, chasing rumor of good timber and good land in the growing Wyoming Territory. They settled near the young town of Coldwater Bend, a huddle of buildings against a slow green river, where Thomas took work in the coal seams that ran beneath the foothills and Naomi turned their rented plot into something like a home, mending harnesses for neighbors who could not afford new ones, restoring broken furniture left for firewood, teaching herself to read a ledger so she could keep their small accounts honest even when the mine paid Thomas in scrip instead of coin. She never bore a child who lived past its first winter, a grief she carried privately and without complaint, the way her mother had taught her to carry all hard things, not buried, but folded neatly and set aside where it would not spill onto others. What she and Thomas built instead was a kind of quiet partnership, the two of them against the hardness of the territory, each evening spent counting small victories instead of large sorrows. It was Thomas's younger brother, Elias, who worried Naomi from the very first supper she shared with the Weller family. Elias had a salesman's warmth and a gambler's eyes, and though he called her sister with apparent affection, she noticed how carefully he watched whatever passed through Thomas's hands, wages, deeds, favors, as though calculating what portion might eventually belong to him. Thomas, generous to a fault and slow to think ill of blood, lent Elias money more times than Naomi ever knew the full count of, and co-signed notes at the Sparrow Creek bank that Elias swore he would repay within the season. Naomi kept her own counsel about her brother-in-law, not because she trusted him, but because she had learned from her father that speaking too soon against a thing often did more damage than the thing itself. She simply watched, and remembered, and quietly kept her own small store of coin apart from the household accounts. The way a woman raised among broken wheels learns to keep a spare wedge of wood in her apron pocket, just in case. By the time she was 38, Naomi Weller had become known through Coldwater Bend not for any single grand act of kindness, but for 100 small ones, the woman who could resole a boot with scraps of harness leather, who nursed sick livestock back from the edge for families who could not afford the horse doctor, who never once in 14 years asked to be repaid for what she gave. It was, she would later understand, the very thing that made it so easy for Elias Weller to turn the town against her, because a woman with no debts owed to her has, in the eyes of frightened people, an unnerving kind of independence, and independence, when a woman possesses it, is so very often mistaken by small men for guilt. The mine took Thomas from her in the early spring of 1891, in a collapse that claimed 3 other men alongside him. All of them buried under a hillside that had seemed as permanent as the mountains around it. Naomi wore black for the appropriate season and did not weep where the town could see her, and in the months after, she discovered the particular loneliness of a widow whose grief the community expects to witness performed rather than felt. It was during that same spring, while she was still learning the shape of her own solitude, that Elias Weller came to call, dressed finer than she had ever seen him. Speaking softly of family obligation and the debts Thomas had co-signed at the bank, debts, he explained with practiced sorrow, that now fell to the estate, and therefore to her. Naomi had kept careful books throughout her marriage, and she knew, with the clean certainty of arithmetic, that the sums Elias described did not match what Thomas had ever told her he owed. When she said so, gently but plainly, Elias's warmth curdled overnight into something colder. Within a fortnight, whispers moved through Coldwater Bend that the widow Weller had been seen counting money late at night that could not be accounted for. That the church poor box had come up short the same week, that grief perhaps had unsettled her judgment along with her honesty. Naomi never learned exactly who first spoke the rumor aloud in public, though she had her private suspicions. And she watched with a kind of sick fascination as neighbors she had nursed through fevers began crossing the street rather than greet her. The bank, holding notes co-signed in Thomas's name and now conveniently amplified by Elias's testimony of family debt, foreclosed on the small homestead within the year, and Elias himself, magnanimous before witnesses, offered to take the land off the estate's hands to spare her further shame. She left Coldwater Bend in the autumn of 1891 with a single trunk, $11 sewn into her hem where a lifetime of caution had taught her to hide what mattered, and no clear notion of where a woman with a ruined name might go to begin again. She walked, when the coach fare ran short, along the river road toward a town she had only heard mentioned in passing, a half-abandoned settlement called Sparrow Creek, where an outlaw named Cutter Hallow had been shot dead more than 20 years before and where, folk said, his old barn still stood on the edge of town, cursed and unclaimed, because no one wanted anything that had belonged to him. Sparrow Creek in 1891 was less a town than the memory of one, a scatter of weathered buildings clinging to a bend in the creek that gave it its name. Its population thinned by a played-out silver claim and a general drift of ambition toward the railroad towns further west. Naomi arrived on a wagon driven by a kindly grain hauler who took pity on a woman walking alone, and she found lodging for 2 nights above the mercantile with the last of her coach money, spending her days listening carefully to the talk of the few dozen souls who remained. It was in the mercantile that she first heard the name Cutter Hallow spoken, in the hushed, half-superstitious tone people reserve for the dead who still unsettle them. And it was there she learned that the county was auctioning off the old Hallow barn and its scrap of land for unpaid taxes, and that no one in Sparrow Creek wanted to bid on cursed ground. The barn itself, when Naomi walked out to see it, looked less like an opportunity than a warning, its roof swaybacked and shedding shingles. One wall bowed outward as though the whole structure were exhaling its last breath, the yard around it choked with sagebrush that had grown up undisturbed for 2 decades. But Naomi had learned long ago to see past the ruin to the bones beneath it, and standing in the tall grass with the autumn wind moving through the broken boards, she noted the soundness of the foundation stones, the honest square cut of the old timber, the way the frame, despite everything, still held true. When the county clerk, a tired man named Percival Grange, announced the barn and its acre would go to whoever paid the back taxes owed, which came to $5 even, Naomi found herself stepping forward before she had fully decided to, laying the coins on his desk with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. The handful of onlookers murmured that the widow must be simple, or desperate, or both, to spend her last money on a dead man's ruin, and Naomi let them believe whatever comforted them. Because she had nowhere left to sleep that night but under that very roof, curse or no curse. Her first night in the barn, she slept in the driest corner with her trunk for a pillow, listening to the wind test the loose boards above her. And in the gray hour before dawn she woke to the sound of something small scurrying through the old horse stalls at the far end. Rather than fear, what rose in her was the old, familiar instinct her father had planted decades before, curiosity about the shape of a thing. The itch to understand what still worked and what had failed. In the thin morning light she began, without any particular plan beyond simple survival, to clear the stalls of the debris of 20 untended years, sweeping out mouse nests and rotted straw. Testing each board for rot with the flat of her palm the way she had once tested wagon wheels. It was in the third stall, the one nearest the old tack room, that her hand found something the others had not, a floorboard that gave not with the soft yield of rot but with the deliberate looseness of a board cut to be lifted. Beneath it, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and was now stiff and brittle with age, she found a flat tin box no larger than a Bible, its hinges rusted nearly solid. It took her the better part of an hour, working with the patience she had learned coaxing frozen wagon axles back to life, to pry it open without breaking whatever lay inside. What she found was a single folded letter, the ink faded to the color of weak tea, addressed on the outside in a careful, deliberate hand to whoever finds this barn honest, and beneath the letter, wrapped separately, a small bundle of papers she did not yet dare unfold, their edges embossed with what looked, even in the dim light, like the seal of the Territorial Land Office. Naomi sat back on her heels in the cold morning air, the letter trembling slightly in her hands, and understood. With the particular clarity that comes to people who have spent their lives noticing what others overlook, that she had not bought a ruin for $5 after all. The letter, when she finally worked up the steadiness to read it by lamplight that evening, was signed with a single name, Nathaniel Hallow. Called Cutter by those who knew him, and it was not the confession of a guilty man that the town's old stories had led her to expect. Cutter Hallow wrote, in a hand that grew increasingly urgent across the pages, that he had once been a surveyor's clerk for the Territorial Land Office in the years just after the war. Employed under a young official named Josiah Pratt. And that in the course of his ordinary duties he had discovered that dozens of homestead claims in the Sparrow Creek Valley had been quietly altered in the official record, boundaries redrawn, filing dates falsified, so that land legitimately claimed and improved by settling families was instead recorded as vacant and available, later to be sold at a fraction of its worth to a railroad surveying concern in which Pratt himself held a hidden interest. Hallow wrote that when he tried to bring the fraud to the attention of the territorial governor, he found every door quietly closed to him, every witness suddenly forgetful. And that within a season he had been accused instead of robbing a stagecoach he swore he had never touched, a crime that conveniently discredited any word he might still speak against Pratt. He had gathered what proof he could before he was forced to flee, original filing papers, witnessed affidavits from settlers who had lost their claims, a copied page of the falsified ledger itself, and hidden them beneath the floor of his own family's barn, intending to find a lawyer honest enough to carry the fight forward. He never got the chance. A posse organized by men loyal to Pratt's interests found him first, and he was shot on the Sparrow Creek Road in the autumn of 1868, dying. The letter's final line explained with a kind of weary grace, without ever having wronged the valley he was accused of robbing. Naomi read the letter 3 times before she allowed herself to unwrap the bundled papers beneath it, and there, exactly as Hallow had described, she found the copied ledger page in a clerk's careful hand, showing claim after claim struck through and reassigned, and beneath those, a half-dozen sworn affidavits. Their ink browned but their signatures still legible. From settlers whose names she recognized from the very county records she had glanced through at the clerk's office only days before, families whose descendants, she would soon learn, still lived scattered through the valley, many of them tenant farmers now on land their grandparents had once owned outright. She spent the following days moving carefully through Sparrow Creek, asking quiet questions of the few old-timers who remembered the Hallow name, careful not to reveal what she had found before she understood the full shape of it. It was Ruth Alderman, an elderly widow who kept bees on the edge of town and remembered Cutter Hallow as a shy, bookish young man rather than the outlaw of legend, who first confirmed for Naomi that Josiah Pratt had indeed once worked the land office before the war's end. and had since grown into one of the most respected men in the territory, owner now of the Sparrow Creek Trust and Savings, the very bank that held mortgages on half the valley's remaining farms. Including, Naomi realized with a cold jolt, the very notes that had allowed Elias Weller to force her from her own home in Coldwater Bend. The two men, she came slowly to understand, had crossed paths in business dealings over the years, Pratt's bank quietly financing men like Elias who understood. Whether through greed or simple moral laziness, how convenient it could be to have a woman's reputation ruined rather than her debts properly examined. The deeper Naomi dug, working evenings by lamplight after long days spent stabilizing the barn's roof with borrowed tools and her own aching hands, the more the shape of an old injustice became visible beneath the dust of 20 years. She matched names from the affidavits against the tax rolls Percival Grange kept at the county office, and found that nearly every family Hallow had tried to protect had, in the decade since, lost their land outright to foreclosure or been reduced to tenancy on ground their own grandparents had cleared, all while the Sparrow Creek Trust and Savings, and the railroad concern quietly tied to it, had grown steadily richer on the very acres Hallow died trying to save. She began, cautiously, to speak with a few of these families directly, starting with a weathered farmer named Obadiah Reyes, whose grandfather's name appeared plainly in one of the affidavits, and watched the old disbelief in his eyes slowly give way to something that looked almost like grief for a wrong he had never known to grieve. It did not take long for word to travel that the widow living out in the old Hallow barn had been asking pointed questions about land titles and the bank's history, and Josiah Pratt himself, now silver-haired and impeccably dressed, called on her personally on a cold afternoon in early winter, arriving in a fine carriage that looked entirely out of place against the barn's weathered boards. He was courteous in the particular way of men accustomed to never being refused, offering first a generous sum for the barn and its acre, framed as an act of charity toward a struggling widow. And when Naomi declined with polite firmness, his courtesy thinned quickly into something harder. He reminded her, without ever quite threatening her outright, that a woman alone with an already tarnished reputation might find it difficult to be believed against a man of his standing. And that old outlaw stories, however romantically embellished by lonely widows, held little weight in a court of law. Naomi said nothing of what she had found beneath the barn's floorboards, only thanked him for his concern and watched his carriage roll away down the frozen road. And in the days that followed she noticed, with the wary attention of a woman who had once seen an entire town turned against her by rumor alone, that new whispers had begun moving through Sparrow Creek, that the widow at the Hallow place was unstable, perhaps touched by grief, digging through an outlaw's ruin the way desperate people dig through anything when they have nothing left to lose. She recognized the pattern instantly, having lived through its twin in Coldwater Bend, and understood that Pratt intended to discredit her before she could ever be believed. The same quiet method that had cost Cutter Hallow his life and his name more than 20 years before. What Pratt did not account for was that Naomi Weller had learned, across a lifetime of mending broken things, that patience was not the same as surrender. Rather than confront him directly, she spent the following weeks quietly building what Cutter Hallow himself had never lived long enough to build, an unshakable web of corroborating proof. She wrote, with careful and unhurried hand, to a territorial land office clerk in Cheyenne whose name appeared in the old ledger as an honest man who had briefly questioned the irregular filings before being transferred away, and received back a reply confirming his own faint memory of the disputed claims. She wrote out, in weather growing steadily colder, to speak with each of the families named in Hallow's affidavits, gathering their own memories of land lost and mortgages mysteriously called due. Memories that lined up, family by family, with the pattern in the old ledger page like teeth in a gear. And she wrote, at last, to a young newspaper woman in Cheyenne named Constance Doyle, whose reputation for pursuing territorial corruption Naomi had heard spoken of admiringly even in Sparrow Creek's dwindling mercantile, enclosing a careful, unemotional account of what she had found and inviting her to see the evidence herself before drawing any conclusions. Constance Doyle arrived in Sparrow Creek on a bitter January morning, and after 2 full days examining the ledger page, the affidavits, and the corroborating letters Naomi had gathered, declared plainly over supper at Ruth Alderman's kitchen table that the story was, in her professional judgment, both true and enormous, not merely the vindication of one long-dead outlaw, but proof of a fraud that had quietly enriched some of the territory's most respected men at the direct expense of the very settlers they claimed to serve. Word of Constance Doyle's presence in Sparrow Creek reached Josiah Pratt within the day, as such things always did in a territory where telegraph lines carried gossip as efficiently as business. And he arrived again at the barn that very evening, his composure cracking for the first time into something closer to naked alarm. Offering now a sum so large that Naomi understood at once how frightened he truly was. She refused him again, and this time she told him plainly what she had found. Watching the color drain slowly from his face as she recited details he had clearly believed buried forever beneath 20 years of dust and silence. Pratt did not shout or threaten, in the end, but simply sat very still in Ruth Alderman's front room, an old man confronted at last with a debt he had spent his whole life avoiding. And when he finally spoke, it was to ask, in a voice gone suddenly small, what she intended to do with what she knew. Naomi Weller's answer, when it came, surprised even those who had come to know her best in the short months since her arrival in Sparrow Creek. She did not demand Pratt's ruin outright, nor did she seek to enrich herself from what she had uncovered. Though both were plainly within her power now that Constance Doyle stood ready to publish the story across the territory. Instead, she proposed, with the same steady patience she had once applied to a splitting wagon wheel, a public reckoning conducted not in secrecy but in daylight. Before the Territorial Land Commission itself, where every family named in Cutter Hallow's affidavits would have the chance to reclaim what had been quietly taken from them. And where Pratt would face the judgment not of a mob's whispered rumor, but of proper law working, for once, exactly as it was meant to. The hearing was convened in Cheyenne in the early spring of 1892. In a crowded territorial land office packed with settlers who had traveled from as far as 3 days out to hear their grandparents' names read aloud from papers many had never known existed. Naomi stood before the commission in a plain gray dress, her hand steady though her heart was not, and told the story exactly as she had lived it, the barn bought for $5. The floorboard that gave beneath her palm, the letter addressed to whoever finds this barn honest. She read Cutter Hallow's own words into the record. Watched the commissioners' faces shift from polite skepticism to something graver as Constance Doyle's corroborating research was entered alongside the original ledger page. And stood quietly aside as, one by one, the families of Sparrow Creek came forward to speak of land their grandparents had cleared with their own hands and lost to a fraud none of them had ever been permitted to understand. Josiah Pratt, present at the hearing on the advice of a lawyer who clearly believed silence his safest course, said almost nothing throughout the proceedings. And when the commission at last ruled that the disputed claims be reopened and reassigned according to the original filings Hallow had preserved, he left the building through a side door. His fine carriage waiting to carry him away from a valley that would never again receive him as its most respected man. The restoration that followed unfolded slowly, as honest justice so often does, but it unfolded surely. Obadiah Reyes and a dozen other families received clear title to land their families had worked for 2 generations without ever truly owning, and the Sparrow Creek Trust and Savings, its foundation quietly cracked by the revelations, came under new and more careful ownership within the year. Cutter Hallow's name, which had haunted the valley as a curse for 20 years, was formally cleared by territorial proclamation. His grave in the small Sparrow Creek Cemetery marked at last with a stone that told the truth of what he had died trying to do. And Elias Weller, whose own dealings with Pratt's bank came under fresh scrutiny once the fraud became public record, found himself facing creditors of his own within the season. The homestead he had taken from Naomi returning, through a legal process she never sought but did not refuse, back into her name alone. We think often, in the quiet after a story like this one, of how easily the world mistakes a ruin for something worthless, and how rarely it stops to ask what still holds true beneath the collapse. Naomi Weller was 41 years old and cast out with nothing when she paid her last $5 for a dead outlaw's barn, and the town that watched her do it believed, quite reasonably by every visible measure, that she had thrown away her final coin on foolishness. But Naomi had learned, long before she ever set foot in Sparrow Creek, that value does not always announce itself plainly. That a broken wheel and a broken reputation and a barn nobody wanted can each conceal, beneath their ruin, something worth far more than the price anyone was willing to pay for them. What Cutter Hallow left sealed beneath that floorboard was never gold, though for 20 years the valley had whispered that it might be. It was simply the truth, patiently waiting for someone willing to kneel in the dust and look for it. Naomi remained in Sparrow Creek, rebuilding the barn plank by plank with the same patient hands that had once mended wagon wheels and harness leather. Until it stood again as solidly as the day Cutter Hallow's family first raised it. She never remarried, though she wanted for company among the families who now considered her something between a neighbor and a quiet legend, and she kept, framed simply above her hearth, the letter addressed to whoever finds this barn honest, as a reminder to herself and to anyone who visited that the truth is patient, and that patience, more often than courage or wealth, is what finally sets old wrongs right. Thank you for spending this time with Naomi Weller and the valley she helped restore. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things are so rarely worthless, and that a quiet, patient hand can still set old wrongs right. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? Tell us in the comments below, and let this story sit with you a while. Until next time, stay close.